Hi, welcome to another episode of Humanism Today, the podcast where we dive into ideas, stories, and conversations that inspire humanist freethinkers and like-minded people. This podcast is presented by the Humanists and Freethinkers of Fairfield County in Connecticut. Our motto is compassion and reason. Compassion means that we care about all people and their rights regardless of their status in society or their personal condition. Reason means that we use science, facts, logic, and scientific methods to find the truth.
It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Novella, a distinguished neurologist, educator, and tireless advocate for critical thinking. Steve earned his MD from Georgetown University and completed his residency training in neurology at Yale. Steve is the host of the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, one of the most popular science podcasts internationally, which was started back in May of 2005. Steve was a founding member of the New England Skeptics Society and is now an active collaborator with several leading skeptical organizations. This past May, the second Nauticon conference was held in White Plains, New York. Entitled Skeptical Mystery Tour for a Beals-led theme, several members of HFFC attended this quite different type conference, which infuses more socializing, fun, and interactive events than a normal science-based conference. The next Nauticon conference will be held in Sydney, Australia in July of 2026. Since Steve is not busy enough, he recently launched a new podcast entitled Political Reality with political science, data science, and comedian Andrea Jones-Roy. Tonight, Steve is going to let us in on what happens when skeptics disagree. God, GMO, and gender. Please join me in welcoming back to HFFC our friend Dr. Stephen Novella.
Thanks for having me back at the HFFC. I've been giving my first talk for the local Connecticut Humanists in the 1990s, before the Skeptics Guide podcast, just when we were just another local, organization trying to promote rationalism. Somebody brought up even earlier, what's the difference between a humanist and a rationalist, or whatever, an atheist, a skeptic? What does it all mean? I think really it's one big umbrella. We like to explain the world without invoking magic, without invoking supernaturalism, based upon facts, actual evidence that's somewhat verifiable, and internally consistent logic. I mean, that's pretty much what we're all after. We just want to believe what's real and not believe in magic and nonsense. So you would think that if people who broadly agree on that approach to knowledge, that we would basically agree on big questions about factual reality. And we largely do. But we're people, and so we find things to argue about, like every other organization, group, subculture in the world. And groups split apart because we focus on our differences rather than our similarities. There are always purists, like you believe something slightly different than I do, so you have to be banished to the outer darkness. And that's unfortunately happened in our broader rationalist movement as well. But that tends to sort of self-evict the extremist, in my opinion, and the reasonable people, the 80% or whatever, who are like, yeah, it's all whatever, it's all good. They tend to stick around. But I like to focus on topics. Usually, most of the times I'm giving a talk at organizations like this one, which are already kind of on board with rationalism. I mean, I could talk about UFOs all day, but we kind of all agree, I think, that there's not much evidence that we're being visited by aliens. So I like to focus on topics that I think people disagree upon, even people who are scientifically minded rationalists. This talk is about all the things I think that we disagree about. And this has just been over my career as a skeptic. What are the topics that have caused the most internal disagreement? All right. Now the main topic. This is what I think is the current most vociferous disagreement among skeptics. Like, this is literally dividing skeptical organizations. People are walking out over disagreements on this issue. It is clearly far and away the most divisive issue. And it comes down to really silly semantics. It is ridiculous that we cannot, agree on this issue about basic facts. Is biological sex in humans strictly, mostly, or basically binary, right? You would think that this is a biological question with an objective biological answer. Now, that doesn't mean whatever your answer is to that question does not necessarily dictate your answer to should trans women be able to play in female sporting leagues, right? I mean, that's a different application of this. We're not even getting off of first base with the most basic question because, again, in my experience, people who have a set of beliefs on the trans issue they're all on one side of the issue. Very few people are like, yeah, it's not binary, but I still don't think that trans women should be in sports or that we should have trans women in female prisons. It's usually all on one side or on the other. But let me go through my thinking on this just to show where we tend to divide. And again, when you really get down to it, it's kind of silly that as allegedly the most rational people on the planet, we're having this much of an emotional disagreement over something so fundamental. All right, let me just ask you a basic question. How would you describe this set of colored shapes? Just describe what you see. Just think in your head. How would you describe what you see? Now, when you look at it, they're different shapes. Looks like they're either blue or pink, and they're clustered into groups, circles of blue shapes and pink shapes. But then when you keep looking, you'll notice that, there are some circles that have both blue and pink. And there's one circle over there that has a purple shape in it. So now I ask you a question. Is this a strictly binary set of groupings here? Is it strictly binary? I mean, it's pretty obviously the answer is no. It's mostly binary. And now, should we say, well, it's mostly binary, that's close enough, we're going to treat it as binary? Or we say, well, say what you like, it's not strictly binary. Say, well, what if we only count the squares? And we say, well, the squares are either pink or blue. So they're binary, therefore these are binary. Is that a rational way to decide whether the entire group is binary by just focusing on the squares? And you may have a reason for thinking that squares are the best shape or they're the most important one or whatever, but that's basically what people are doing. And let me now apply this logic here. So this is a picture of an actress. You may recognize her. She's famous enough, that people may have recognized her from one show or another. Would you say that this person is a woman? Who here would confidently say, this is a woman? Who here would not confidently say without reservation that this is a woman? And who's not going to raise their hand no matter what I ask? Right. So even those who raised their hand and say, yeah, that's a woman, you were a little hesitant about it. And there was a disagreement in the room about whether you would say unequivocally that this is a woman. Why is that? Is it because the concept of woman is a little subjective, right? Or if it's a completely objective category, there shouldn't be a disagreement. Now, you might think that it is completely objective and discrete, but you don't have enough information. So then, if you don't have enough information from looking at someone who looks obviously female, what is the information that you're missing? So what is the definition of a woman? And we could also ask a number of different questions. What's the definition of a woman? What's the definition of a human female? And are these the same thing? Or are they distinct things? So I'm going to ask you a related question, which is virtually the identical question philosophically. Is that a bird or a dinosaur? It's an Archaeopteryx, right? Is that a bird or a dinosaur? It's both, but is it a bird? It is both. Would you say it's a bird? Well, okay, why? Why is it a bird? It has feathers. It's got feathers. It apparently could fly, but it still has, not all birds fly. It could be, it's not secondarily flightless though. It flies, right? You could say birds either fly or they had an ancestor who flew. That's pretty much true of all birds. But it has a bony tail. It has teeth. It lacks a lot of adaptations for flight that modern birds have. It's pretty much 50-50. Like it's 50% theropod dinosaur, 50% bird. So is it a bird or is it a theropod dinosaur? Is there an objectively right or wrong answer to that question? Right? No, it's a transitional fossil, right? It's a transitional creature. So there is no objective right or wrong answer. Now, Duane Gish, that name still resonates in this community. People know who Duane Gish was. He was a creationist who debated evolutionary scientists. And you almost universally trounced the scientists in the debate. It's what he was famous for. And how would he do that? He would do it by what came to be known as the Gish Gallop, right? He would just throw misconception after misconception after them. They could never deal with all of them because it was sort of an open-ended debate structure. And the audience, who was usually packed with his followers, would walk away with the sense, well, that scientist couldn't answer even a small fraction of the questions that he raised about evolution, so there's got to be something wrong with it, right? That was kind of the debate strategy. But one he said about Archaeopteryx was, clearly it was a bird. It had feathers and it flew, therefore it was a bird. It's like, okay, but is that the definition of a bird? Is that the objective definition of it? He also said, well, either that or it's a dinosaur, because it has teeth and a bony tail, but it's one or the other, right? It has to be one or the other. It can't be halfway in between, because that's evolution. So now let's talk about generally recognized features of biological sex. Now we're not talking about gender. We're not talking about man or woman. We're talking about male and female. We're talking about biological sex. Sex is... there are two sexes, right? So I think there's no disagreement about that biologically there are two sexes. That doesn't mean that it's strictly binary, though, because you can have a system that has two poles, but not be strictly binary if there are some individual members who are a mix of both, or individual who have ambiguous features or whatever, right? So no one is saying there's a third sex. It's just that, again, it depends on how you define sex, but from this system is binary, right? The system is binary. So in humans, XY is male, XX is female. If you have XY chromosomes, your gonads turn into testes and produce sperm, which produces testosterone and other hormones, which then affect the development of your reproductive organs down a certain pathway. Again, there's only two pathways, developmental pathways that are possible here. Either you have a penis or a vagina, and you have masculine secondary sexual characteristics, right? I left sexual orientation and gender identity empty there because this is, I think, a matter of current debate, although I don't think it's much of a debate scientifically. As a neurologist, as a neuroscientist, is sexual orientation and gender identity biological or not? Well, I would argue it's pretty clearly neurological, and the last time I checked, the brain was a biological organ. And so why wouldn't it be biological, right? So female, of course, is XX. Their gonads become ovaries. They make more estrogen, less testosterone. Their organs develop into a uterus, a vagina, and female secondary sexual characteristics, right? So people look at that and say, see, sex is binary because there's only two pathways. It's like, okay, let's get back to this person who not everyone was sure was a woman. This is somebody who has a very particular disorder. This is androgen insensitivity. In this case, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So she has XY chromosomes. She has testes. Her testes did not descend, so she has undescended testes. They made sperm, but the sperm never matured because they were undescended. It's too hot, and that's why, that's why our testes have to hang outside of our body so that they're a couple of degrees colder so that sperm can mature. Her testes were removed when she was a young girl because her parents lied to her, told her you had abnormal ovaries that have to be removed for your health, even though they knew they were testes. She makes male levels of testosterone, right? Typical male levels of testosterone. She has a vas deferens, not a uterus, because that's another hormone that she does have. However, her cells do not respond to testosterone. She has androgen insensitivity syndrome. So as far as the rest of her body is concerned, she does not have testosterone. So she developed a vagina, complete set of female secondary sexual characteristics. She's a typical heterosexual female with a female gender identity, right? So she was identified female at birth. She has lived her life as a woman. She is married to a cis hetero male and had no idea that she was not a typical woman who just had her ovaries removed when she was a teenager because they were abnormal, until when she was in her 20s, I think, or 30s, when she discovered that she actually was an XY individual with what was removed was testes. She had high levels of testosterone and female secondary sexual characteristics because she does not respond to testosterone. So I put it to you, now that you have all the information you could possibly have, is this individual a man or a woman? Is there an objective answer to that question? Does context matter? I think her husband probably considers her to be a woman. I think in pretty much most social contexts, society would treat her as a woman. I don't think anybody would say, you have to go into the male restroom because you have XY chromosomes, right? That seems kind of perverse, doesn't it? Doesn't really make any sense, doesn't really fit. She has a vagina, she's a female physically. She should use the female bathroom. But there are people who argue that she's a man. Why? Because she has testes. Therefore, she's a man. And that's it. We should, just like saying we should only look at the square, there are skeptical biologists, scientists who say we should only look at the gametes. That's it. Gametes is the beginning and the ending of whether or not we consider somebody to be male or female. Therefore, sex is strictly binary in all contexts, now and forever, end of story. I'm kind of using a little bit of hyperbole to make it seem as ridiculous as I think it is. But they passionately believe that, and they think that I have lost my mind because I say that that's not the best way to approach this question. I'm not a real skeptic. I am somehow caving to woke liberal ideology because I think that this person should not be treated as a man in every context because she has or had testes, right? But that's absurd in my opinion. It's absurd. And of course, there are other skeptical biologists who agree with me and who say, last time I checked, people were not single-celled creatures, right? We are more than gametes. We are complex multicellular life forms with complicated manifestations. And being a human being is more than just your gametes. What's really interesting is that the sex is binary crowd, if you read their comments online, which unfortunately I have, sometimes to my own articles or articles about me, because I've publicly opined on this issue, which is a no-no apparently. They say clearly sex is binary. It's XX female, XY male. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Because there's a biologist who says that sex is binary, but they thinks that you're completely wrong. It's only about the gametes. It's not about the chromosomes. Because you could have other sets of chromosomes. You could be XXX, you could be XXY, et cetera, et cetera. Chromosomes are not strictly binary. So you're pontificating about how scientific you are and how unscientific people who think that sex is not strictly binary is. Meanwhile, you don't even know what the thing is you're supposed to believe, right? You don't even know that it's supposed to be about the gametes, not about the chromosomes. Or there are others who say, hey, if you got a penis, you're a male, and if you have a vagina, you're a female, right? What was that movie? They made a whole movie about that where they challenged people, say, what's a woman? And then their conclusion is basically, if you have a dick, you're a guy, right? And if you have a vagina, you're a woman. Say, okay, so this is a woman, which means that the scientists who think that it's all about gametes think that you're a pseudoscientist because you think it's all about the equipment and not the gametes. The bottom line is, arbitrary. It's categorization. So when you categorize things, you have to choose what the defining characteristics are. And that's an arbitrary choice because reality is more complicated than any system of categorization that we come up with. So if you choose for testes, for gametes to be the defining characteristic, then sure, then by your narrow definition, sex is binary. But should that dictate our thinking about and policies towards human sexuality in every context? Should prisons be divided up by gametes? Then she belongs in a male prison if she ever committed a crime that warranted going to prison. She should be competing in male sporting competitions. She should be using the men's bathroom. Of course, that's ridiculous. It's absurd. This is a woman by really all reasonable, in my opinion, definition. She is physically, mentally a woman. So the only conclusion you can come to is that biological sex in humans is not strictly binary because there are people who do not fit in the binary. There are people who literally have every permutation of the different features that I have listed up here that have different chromosomes, that have different hormone levels, who have ambiguous genitalia, who have ambiguous secondary sexual characteristics, who have a sexual orientation that is more typical of the other phenotype, who have a gender identity that's more typical of the other phenotype, every permutation. Who are we to say which subset of features are the defining characteristics for everybody in all situations forever? I think it's silly. We have to just recognize it's complicated, Now, I have problems with some of the messaging about this. Like, I know that it is popular to say that a trans woman is a woman, and I get it. I know where that's coming from, but I think that that's problematic messaging because it's buying into the binary that we're trying to say is the problem unto itself. A trans woman is not a cis woman. These are two different things. It's fine to say that they're both women, but you can't erase the fact that they're not the exact same thing because in some contexts, they're different. In a medical context, for example, if a patient of mine says, I'm a woman, and they're a trans woman, and they don't think that that's an important detail to tell me, they're mistaken. That is an important detail to tell me, because they're a trans woman, right? So in a medical context, I want all of this information. I don't care what label you apply to it. I just need all the details. What about in an athletic context? Well, this is something that collectively we're struggling with because there's no right answer that satisfies all ethical and moral and fairness and other concerns, right? There's only trade-offs, and people will make different trade-offs, and that's fine. But what some people who are, I think, thoughtfully trying to advocate for the rights of all athletes, cis athletes, trans athletes, all athletes have said is that what we need to do is come up with a way of defining athletically male and athletically female. So I like that approach because it means I'm not saying you're not a woman. This is not about whether you're a man or a woman in any other context. This is about safe and fair competition. And if you are athletically male, that means it may not be safe or fair to have you compete with athletic females. But of course, there's a fuzzy boundary in the middle, because what if you are a trans woman who had hormone blockers, never went through puberty as a male, and now you take female hormones, and you're basically athletically female now, or at least you're 80% of the way there, or whatever. And the question is, well, how much is enough, right? Is 80% enough, or does it have to be 100%? And I've had people argue, if it's not 100%, it's everything but 99% and lower, you're male. It's like, okay, but that seems a bit extreme. That doesn't really seem fair or even follow basic common sense. And again, I disagree with people who say, like, if you identify with a female, you compete against females. It's like, well, that doesn't seem fair either, right? And again, I get it. You can identify yourself any way you want, and if you can be socially a woman, you could be effectively a woman in many contexts. Maybe you should use a female bathroom. But if you're athletically male, you haven't had hormone blockers, you went through puberty as a male, it isn't fair. from many perspectives to compete against people who are athletically female. And of course, this depends upon your age and what sport. Maybe it doesn't matter in some sports. And also what level we're talking about. Does it really matter in grade school? No. Does it matter? Who cares? Does it matter? Let them compete on whatever team they want to compete on. Does it matter in college? Well, in adult people who are physically adults, we have to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach to that. Does it matter with the Olympics? Well, yeah, I think that they probably have some vested interest in carefully regulating the biology of their athletes. They don't let them take certain kinds of hormones, et cetera, et cetera. It seems reasonable to take this approach. Right? This is not an ideologically purist approach. It's nuanced, it's complicated, it recognizes that sex is not binary in many ways and that there's no right or wrong answer. We're often at cross purposes, but we got to make the best compromise we can, and no one's going to be happy, right? And that's basically what compromise means. And as skeptics, as rationalists, as people who think critically, I think we should be comfortable with this nuance and comfortable with the notion that there are people who are going to disagree with you and that have good reasons for disagreeing with you. You may disagree with what I'm saying. That's fine. I welcome that. If you feel like you can give me a more nuanced or different perspective that I hadn't considered, I love it. That's great. That's why I like talking about controversial topics. Agreeing is boring. But we got to do it in a way that respects each other's the fact that we're all skeptics, we're all rationalists, we're trying to approach this reasonably, recognize that we have an ideology and an identity and that we're looking at it from a certain perspective, and be humble about that as well. And just all this finger pointing and catastrophism and you're not a real skeptic and walking out of organizations is just so ridiculous for a skeptical movement, for a rational movement. We really can and should do better. This is just to point out, because it's come up specifically as a challenge. Hermaphrodism, which is people who basically make sperm and eggs, does exist in humans. It's very rare, but it does exist. So even the gamete approach has its exceptions. Now the thing, just in fairness, what a lot of the people say about the people with a disorder of sexual development, right, a DSD, they say, well, that's not the same thing as being trans. I'd say that's different. If you have testosterone insensitivity, that's not somebody who is completely biologically male but just thinks that they're a woman. It's like, okay, so this gets to the do you think the brain is biological question in my opinion. So what's interesting is that all of that level of objection to trans identity, that it's just you just are choosing to believe that you are a woman in a man's body or vice versa, whatever, that's just psychological, right? This is actually a form of mental illness denial, too. It's a neuroscience denial thing. You're saying it's just people are just choosing to do this. It's like, well, all of these objections were raised to homosexuality a generation or two ago, right? If you go back to the 70s, 80s, there were people saying, look, sexual orientation is a choice, right? It's not your brain. It's psychological, right? You were screwed up because of your mother or something, right? Or it's just a social choice you make to the people that you went to college with or whatever. And, we now pretty much almost universally agree that that's nonsense, that no, it is how your brain developed under the influence of various hormones is what determines by and large your sexual orientation. Now that can manifest itself in different ways. That is sort of amenable to culture and society and whatnot. But your basic, and psychologists can study this. It's really easy in men. It's like, what gives you an erection? Men are pretty simple when it comes to this. If you have a penis, you will get an erection when you're exposed to erotic stimuli. What gives you an erection pretty much is your sexual orientation. It's completely biological, and it's in the brain, and it's how the brain developed under the influence pretty much of the environment in the womb and the hormonal environment based upon your genetics and your hormones and your receptors. So it's complicated, messy biology, and that results in your sexual orientation. So my question is, why would we think that gender identity is any different? Why would, I have not seen a reason why we should treat it or think of it as any differently. Now, we don't have the definitive answer to how biological gender identity is. And I also, it seems, from the data that we have so far, although this is a bit of an open question, that there are different subsets of people. And it's easier, I think it's easier to talk about people who have young onset, like as soon as they're old enough to have a gender identity, they have a trans identity, and it is persistent throughout their life. For those people, it's pretty clearly a biological brain phenomenon. There are other subset of people who have a trans identity who acquire that identity later on in life, closer to puberty, and it's not as persistent. It can be more fluid. It's harder to say for that subset of people how biological it is versus how cultural, social, whatever, or psychological. So there's a lot of nuance there that we're still sorting out. And then in those people who do have young onset persistent trans identity, the ones that I think are almost certainly biological, there's preliminary data looking at their brains. And the data is moving in the direction of a trans woman has a brain more like a cis woman than a trans man. What does that mean? It also depends on what part of the brain you're looking at. And it took us a while just to figure that out, because it wouldn't necessarily be different in every part of the brain, only in parts of the brain that probably have some plausible relationship with gender identity. But it does seem to be moving in that direction. Too early to say definitively or to take a strong stance on it. But I wouldn't be surprised if 10, 20 years from now, it's pretty clear that gender identity, for most people, is pretty much like sexual orientation. It's in the brain, it's developmental, it's biological, and therefore it's part of biological sex, right? It's just like anything else. It is a difference of sexual development, just like anything else we're talking about here. But of course, if you have a consistent anti-trans ideology, then no, it's not biological, right? No, sex is binary. None of this matters. I've heard arguments that, again, it's all about the gametes, which makes no sense. Or it's like, okay, maybe there's 0.1% of people who are not binary, but they don't count. There's not enough of them to really matter. At first blush, it's still binary. It's still mostly binary. And I've had this discussion with somebody online where we both agreed that biological sex is only mostly binary. And I said, it's mostly binary, therefore not binary. And they said, yeah, it's mostly binary, therefore it's binary. So we agreed on the facts, but disagreed on what the ultimate conclusion was. You can make of that what you will. But that's, again, it reinforces this notion that, so at the end of the day, it's just you care whether or not we call it binary, even though you admit it's not strictly binary, because there are people who are not binary. That is the end of my talk. I am happy to hang out for any questions.
Yeah. Jessica, you can ask your question. Thanks.
Hi. So I'm a trans woman and a relatively late transitioner who transitioned at 60. And so I felt like I was on the borderline for much of my life about what my real gender was. And so this is definitely in the bimodal kind of thing where different different aspects of gender, physical gender, there's mental gender, just sort of how you feel, there's preferences, there's how you want to present, you want the world to assume you are. So there's not just one or two things, there are a lot more that are involved. So it gets complicated. I've known a lot of other transgender people, and people are all over the place. And some people do really change their orientation when they change their gender. Their gender, I guess, it's more than just presentation, but their position in society, gender position in society, they sometimes change their orientation. It's not all the time, and it's not even half the time probably, but it's a significant fraction.
Of course. So thanks for your perspective.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and good night.
If you liked this video, you might like one of our videos above, or one of the other videos or podcasts at hffcct.org. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button above. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep thinking humanistically.